Okay, hi everyone. So good afternoon from the UK and Ireland. So we have got two of my sort of colleagues from the GDG community. I'm Jen Ashley from GDG London, and we have Tim. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
I'm Tim Berry from GDG Bristol.
And Ricardo.
I'm Ricardo La Rosa from GDG Cloud Dublin.
Perfect. And of course, we have got Seth as our special guest this afternoon, Seth Vargo. So I think we're just gonna go ahead with the questions in a minute. But Seth is with Google right now, and he was with HashiCorp and other companies before. I'm sure we can chat about that as well as we go on with the questions. But I think I would say, do you want to just quickly say something first before we get on with the questions?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Seth. I'm not based in the UK/Ireland. I'm in the US, but really excited to join you all today. And I have no idea what they're going to ask me. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes.
Great, thank you very much. So shall we get on with Ricardo? I believe you have some questions prepared.
Yes, I have one question prepared. You mentioned once that top talent doesn't have a location. So how are your views on companies that are asking their employees to return to the office once the pandemic is over?
Yeah, so yes, I have many thoughts on remote work. I think that there are certain epicenters like London, New York, San Francisco, where there's a concentration of software engineers, but there's also amazing talent all over the world. The middle of nowhere, rural US, rural UK, rural Ireland, and oftentimes when companies restrict people to relocate, they're excluding candidates. Not everyone is in a position where they can relocate due to a family situation or financial situation, and they're missing out on that talent, and they may be missing out on specific diversity or inclusion efforts because of those requirements. I think it's a little bit foolish, to be honest. If your organization is thriving or continuing to succeed with everyone working from home, why force people to come back into the office? And to be honest, I think we're going to start to see, some people do like to work in an office, and some people really like to work from home. And now that some people have been given the opportunity to work from home, they've never really had that in their career, and it's been forced upon them. They may see some of the benefits, and they may not be willing to go back into an office. And that could cause, turmoil, or we could see people looking to potentially switch careers or move to a different employer that's a little bit more open to remote work. So I actually think that remote work and flexibility is going to become an important checkbox, just like things like benefits and health insurance and paid time off and vacation. I think that's going to be something that talent is going to be looking for as they expand their career search and their job search.
That's hopefully maybe that's a silver lining of everything that's happening.
And I think that it's a double-edged sword. There are some people who are working from home and they're really struggling. Maybe they have, family or loved ones at home that they have to take care of, like young children or older relatives. And being able to go into an office and escape that, it makes them more productive. I think there are some people who have found a really nice balance of, working with their partner or their friends to take care of that. And they're finding, I actually only need to work 6 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day, and I can achieve the same levels of productivity and spend time with my family. And I think, everyone's handling this situation differently. It's obviously something that we've never been faced with before. And I think as people navigate this, we're learning a lot about ourselves. And some people are learning that, the free snacks at the office weren't that exciting in the first place. And I think other people are learning that home is a place where they want to spend time with their family and loved ones, and it's not a place where they want to do business or work. And they really like that separation. And I think this pandemic has forced us to reevaluate, or for the first time, evaluate, where those lines are.
Yeah, I think having more options is just a good thing, though. not the same thing isn't going to work for everyone. But as you said, restricting people to just those single hubs of where a lot of engineers are means you're going to be missing potentially a lot of good candidates. Not everyone in the UK wants to live in London, I can tell you.
I mean, there's also just been some really interesting technical challenges in addition to the cultural challenges with this shift, right? Like, some people had home internet that was, 10 megabits per second, which worked fine for, some Netflix and some casual web browsing. But now, themselves and their family members and maybe children are doing online classes. Like, I think bandwidth consumption is through the roof. You imagine you have two children that are both on video calls for classroom, and then you and a partner are on video calls for work. You're very quickly saturating that network connection. And then on the flip side, I think some corporations that have a traditional security model of like behind the firewall, they have a VPN appliance, and there's limited bandwidth through that VPN. So you have 1,000 employees that are all working from home, and they're all going through that same pipe, right? And that pipe is only 100 megabits, right? And there's only so much that can flow in and out. And I think that's also been a learning opportunity for some of these companies is like, if we want to enable remote work, there's not just a cultural investment, there is also a technological investment that we need to make, whether that's, beefing up our pipes or moving towards a Beyond Corp or a VPN-less or a zero trust model.
Do you think there are SREs at these companies in particular who have seen the other side of these changes? I'm thinking about big collaboration platforms like obviously G Suite and Office 365, where if there are outages, all of a sudden it's affecting everyone, not just the people in the office that day.
I think, with respect to G Suite in particular, and Zoom and Office 365 and Skype and similar platforms, I think people already felt pain if there was an outage, because even when you're working in an office, right, there's satellite offices, there's other locations that are using those technologies. So it's not like you had freedom and flexibility to just let the software go down. I think what's different is now, instead of you reading about it in a postmortem, like your mom is yelling at you, right, like that's the differentiating factor. Is like your neighbors are knocking on the door, being like, hey Tim, I know you work for Google. Why is Hangouts down? Why is my Gmail broken? Right. I think that where the real shift has happened is in the product and innovation area, right? When you look at some of the features and functionality that these video platforms are delivering, again, whether it's 365 or Skype or Zoom or Hangouts or Meet, the rate at which those teams have been able to adapt and build new features and functionality that specifically targets, say, the classroom, or specifically targets, large meetings, whereas previously you had to use like the webinar mode in order to have a meeting with 30 people. Now, we've really pushed the boundaries of that technology and pushed the boundaries of those products so that you can have a meeting with 30 people and, you're not talking over to one another, and the latency and the bandwidth is handled appropriately. And, I've been really impressed across the industry at how quickly we've been able to drive advancements in the remote conferencing world, and the technologies that surround it. And also just like the difference between the consumer grade versus commercial grade hardware, right? If you're in an office, you might have like some really expensive conference bridge and a really nice 4K camera, and you're at home, you have your your 720p laptop and your AirPods, and it is amazing the things like noise cancellation and graceful degradation that have come up pretty recently that make it so that even if you're at home on a crappy internet connection with a terrible camera, you can still be productive and you can still have a meaningful conversation with people as if you were in, a really nice conference room in the office.
I had one more follow-up question specific to the pandemic, but because I know Ricardo's got lots of other questions, but I wanted to ask you about contact tracing. So an interesting thing that happened quite early on in the whole global situation is this collaboration between Google and Apple, and you don't often see really big, players like that working together on something. I wondered if I'm not sure if you were involved at any stage in Google's side of that work, or what you can tell us about that.
Yeah, for sure. So just like slight disclaimer, the technology that we work on and the effort between Google and Apple We call it exposure notifications, not contact tracing, because contact tracing is it has a very specific meaning to epidemiologists and people who study these viruses. And the technology that we're providing is very different. And in fact, contact tracing is typically a very privacy invasive process. So when you imagine, forget about COVID for a second, take something like HIV, right? Traditional contact tracing with HIV involves disclosing, anyone that you've had sexual contact with in the past X days, and then those people get contacted and they ask who they've had contact with, and so on. And there's a lot of exchange of personal information, personal medical information. The system that we've designed and the project that I've been involved in for, I don't know, like 6,000 pandemic days at this point, has called exposure notifications, and it's a joint effort between Google and Apple to help stop the spread of COVID while still preserving the privacy of individual people and the system at large. And the system works by using Bluetooth Low Energy or BLE and randomly rotated identifiers that broadcast, because the vast majority of people have a smartphone or some type of mobile device that has Bluetooth on it, whether it's iOS or Android, and leveraging that property of society, right, where most people have that device or that smart device, we can, in a privacy-preserving way, help people understand if they've potentially been exposed to someone who has tested positive for COVID or who is exhibiting symptoms that look like COVID. And the goal there is not to scare people. It's so, if you get a notification that says, hey, Sally, you potentially have been around someone who's tested positive for COVID, you can now take additional precautions above what you're already taking to, maybe self-quarantine, maybe go get your own test, help you jump the line. If there's a queue to get tests, this might put you at a priority queue depending on the government and the locale that you're in. And it also encourages you to stay away from people who might be immunocompromised or people who are at risk for contracting the virus, right? So if you have, elderly parents or young children, you may choose to take additional precautions in distancing yourself when interacting with them. So it's really the first line of defense, and does not replace traditional contact tracing and is not like in lieu of traditional contact tracing. It's more of a at scale effort.
Yeah. And how has that worked kind of as an extension of what you were talking about, working from home, working with a completely different company, working for Google, but also working with Apple from home? How does that work?
We use a lot of Google Meet calls. So what I'll say is it's interesting because, obviously I work for Google, but all of the work that we're doing around exposure notifications on the Google side is in the open source. So the server component, which is where these random IDs are aggregated and published, that is all in open source. It lives on GitHub. You can follow our day-to-day development. We're doing all of our triaging and communication in GitHub, the same way you would have kind of any other open source project. The same is true on the Android side. So the reference architecture or the reference implementation for the Android app, the mobile app for this project, is also available on GitHub. Again, issues and development happening there. And this is actually very atypical for Google, right? The vast majority of our development happens internally on an internal system, internal source control. We actually have a mono repo that we've talked about publicly a few times. To a certain extent, it's almost like three companies working together. It's Google open source, and Apple. And it's been really exciting. It's been really engaging, right? There's a fair amount of consensus building, many late night meetings and early morning meetings as we try to accommodate people who are in, various time zones, various stakeholders, whether that's West Coast America, East Coast America, London, Australia. One of the things that's pretty unique about this is everyone has been affected in some way, right? Some countries have been affected more than others, but ultimately every nation in the world is a stakeholder to this project, and making sure that they have a voice and making sure that we're including those diverse viewpoints and also the needs of those various countries and regions is super important. But it's been really fun to collaborate with Apple and with Google open source and Google internal, and the project moves faster than anything I've ever worked on. And I've worked at a lot of startups. I was employee number 4 at HashiCorp, and we were we were working out of basically a closet in San Francisco, and this project moves faster than any startup I've ever worked at or any other project that I've ever been on. And it's really reassuring to see that these large companies and these large enterprises that typically don't work this quickly be able to put the resources and move quickly so that we can hopefully move towards some type of mitigation or reducing the curve with respect to this pandemic.
Yeah, it's absolutely it's a testament to power of open source.
Uh,
I'll hand it back to
Before we
Ricardo.
ask the next question, Tim, before we ask the next question, I think I'm gonna just interject and do a bit of a promotion. So Seth is supposed to be joining us on October 17th, but the date didn't work out. So October 17th is the day for DevFest UK in Ireland. So I just want to quickly talk about that before we move on to the questions from Ricardo and Tim. So we have an event happening on October 17th, and it's called DevFest UK and Ireland. We will have 6 tracks on cloud, AI, ML, web, mobile, hot tech, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a very important topic. And we really would like it to be part of the event. And yeah, there are 6 tracks, and there's going to be 60 plus speakers, so it's going to be a very, very busy day for everyone. So we hope you can join us, and you can find more information about it at devfest-uki.com, which is the official website for DevFest UK in Ireland. So we're just going to go back to the questions now from Tim and Ricardo. So who's asking the question next?
I have a question. So what is your take on perimeter-based security? So this idea of adding layers of VPNs and firewalls, and what's your take on that? And what is, could you talk about more about identity-aware proxy?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of hinted at this a little bit before when we were talking about the VPN being the choke point. Perimeter-based security is flawed in the sense that it relies on typically an IP address to authenticate someone's access to a network. And in general, perimeter-based security is structured such that everything inside the perimeter is trusted and everything outside the perimeter is untrusted. And that sounds great in theory, assuming that your perimeter is impenetrable. But I think what we've seen time and time again is that even the most well-architected software could be running on a CPU that has some vulnerability that an attacker can exploit. And we know that you should not structure your security and your access model like an egg, right? An egg has a very hard exoshell, but as soon as you break the exoshell, the internals of the egg are all available to you, and it's terrible. And it's messy and gooey, and now you have raw egg on your hand. And instead, we should really be structuring our applications and our security model a little bit more like an onion or a castle. An onion has multiple layers, and the closer you get to the center, the more difficult it is, the more that you cry, the harder the onion is. And this is very similar to like medieval times. When we look at castles and we look at some of the remains and the architecture that exists, we know that you have your traditional model of like a castle and then a moat and some alligators and a drawbridge. And that's the perimeter, right? The moat is the perimeter. But it turns out people know how to swim. And if you know how to swim, you can get over the moat. And if you know how to avoid alligators, you can get over the moat, without fatality. But if medieval times built just a moat, then anyone who crossed the moat could, effectively get to the king or the queen or the princess and cause damage to the kingdom. So instead, when we look at, the architecture here, we see that there's multiple layers of defense, right? You have archers that would sit on the top in addition to the moat. You had swordsmen and knights who were inside the kind of town wall or the kingdom walls, if you will, that could defend. And then even as you look at the castle itself, stairs were structured in a way to optimize for right-handed people. So it wasn't uncommon for stairs to kind of spiral up and to the right, because that meant if you were a part of the kingdom and you were coming down the stairs because an attacker was trying to reach the king or the queen, you would be swinging with your right hand, but the offensive player, right, the person who's actually trying to get to the king or the queen or the princess, would be at a disadvantage because if they were to swing with their right hand, that's actually up against a wall because it's a kind of a rightward turning staircase. And it's optimizations like this that date back hundreds of thousands of years that we really should be following with respect to our security perimeters, right? We should be thinking about how can we make it really easy for our team to identify and forensically investigate whenever attackers are doing bad things, and how can we make it exponentially more difficult for attackers to progress throughout our system. So, with perimeter-based security, it's kind of like I have this IP address and I've authenticated to retrieve that IP address in some way, and now I can do anything on that network. And the problem is that it doesn't tell you anything about the human on the other side. So if I gain access to someone's laptop, I can remote in, or maybe I steal it from a coffee shop, for example. I can now behave as that person. So we lose the mapping between Seth and Seth's permissions. And instead we have this intermediary, which is an IP that we trust that Seth got that IP, therefore we trust the IP. And that's a flawed assumption. That's really the root of the problem with perimeter-based security. And instead, we should be using Seth to authenticate any and all resources. And this is, something that Google has been pushing since I think like 2007, 2008 with some of the project or the Beyond Corp initiatives that we've been, the white papers that we've been publishing. But at Google, we don't have VPN for accessing most of our systems. There's very few systems at Google that require a VPN to access. The one that comes to mind is IRC is behind a VPN, and that's because it's really hard because of the way that the IRC protocol works to do anything other than a VPN, because IRC is inherently an IP-based protocol. But even accessing, some of our staging and production systems, accessing obviously Gmail and Calendar, our internal code review systems, all of this is guarded by identity, and context-aware access, not an IP address. And that's part of the reason that Google was able to quickly shift to being a remote workforce, is we don't have some centralized VPN appliance that every customer or every Googler has to go through. Instead, we rely on the identity of that user as they're authenticating them to a resource, and we also can authenticate the context to which they're accessing it. So a really good example is, on my phone, I can access my email, my calendar, and a few corporate resources, but I can't actually access any of what we call Google 3, which is our source repository, from my phone. And that's because my phone is inherently untrusted. It's much easier to steal. And I shouldn't really be accessing code from my phone. The situations in which I should be doing that are very rare. So even though I'm using the exact same username and password and multi-factor authentication from my phone as I do on my desktop, because it's a different context, because this is a mobile device, I am not able to access certain properties in the system. And that is part of the context-aware access, which is part of the Beyond Corp initiative. Is it's not just an IP address, it's not just an identity, but it's also the identity coupled with the context from which it's coming from. And IAP, or Identity-Aware Proxy, is a Google Cloud product or service that allows you as a third-party company or consumer to provide that same level of experience on top of legacy software or software that you don't want to directly integrate with some login system. So IAP sits on top of some piece of infrastructure or some system. It could be a ticketing system like Jira or Trello, or it could be some internal application. And basically you're putting Google Login in front of it. And you put the Google Login in front of it, and now it's guarded by not just the identity of the person, but then you can also enable context-aware access, and you can make sure that only people who are accessing this from a desktop that has been trusted in the system can actually progress to log on to your ticketing system or your internal application.
Could you talk about more what was Beyond Corp?
Yeah, so Beyond Corp is a initiative, I would say. It's an umbrella term that describes this idea that the network should not be the trust layer. So it's Beyond Corporation or Beyond Corp. And it's a lot of what I talked about already is like perimeter-based security is not the most ideal structure. Instead, we should be trusting the human or the identity of the machine, not some IP address or some network for authentication. And it's the idea that humans and individual machines are the things that are authenticating, not the underlying network protocols. And it started as Google was doing this again, like I think around 2007, 2008. We started publishing white papers about it, I think around 2010, 2011. There have been many, many white papers since then about, Beyond Corp is, secure. You don't have to have the, everyone goes through the VPN. And now we also offer some of the properties of Beyond Corp as cloud services, like IAP and context-aware access are available as cloud services. So you can wrap those same principles that we're using at Google internally as a service around some of your cloud applications and technologies.
Who's got the next question? Tim?
Yeah, so along the theme of security, I know you are a big proponent of serverless technologies. What's a sort of common rookie security mistake you see people make when they're getting into using serverless stuff for the first time?
All of them. No, so honestly, the biggest mistake is a byproduct of serverless, to be honest, right? So there are certain languages that value their package ecosystem more than others. And there's a really tight coupling between Node.js and the serverless community. And the biggest vulnerability or flaw that I often see is, people are building their first serverless application, and I look at their, package.json, and they have 6,000 dependencies. And they can't tell me what any of them do. Or they can't tell me what all of them do, right? They can say, oh, this is for this and this is for that. And, they're not understanding the dependency graph, and they're not understanding the threat model that comes with pulling in those third-party dependencies, not pinning them to specific versions, so that, yeah, sure, today your application works, but tomorrow it could break. That's like a best case scenario. But like worst case scenario is that everything continues working, but someone, does a hostile takeover of a repository, or is able to, get a pull request through that actually injects some type of malicious code that is, stealing your environment variables, trying to mine Bitcoin, right? Whatever it might be. And this is where, security scanning software and dependency scanning software is super important, because we tend to, in the serverless world, pull in all of these dependencies and all of this ecosystem without a full and complete understanding of the implications of doing so and what all of these dependencies are doing. That in and of itself isn't a unique problem to serverless, though. That the same problem exists if you're running on bare metal or on VMs. So if I were to pick something specific to serverless, I think it's the access model, right? Most serverless things are publicly accessible endpoints that largely can do anything, and oftentimes their permissions are over-provisioned. It's not uncommon to see like a Lambda function or a Google Cloud Run or Google Cloud Function that has, the equivalent of pseudo permissions on the cloud project or the cloud service. And then if an attacker does gain access to it, they can move laterally throughout the system. So when coupled with that, dependency problem I mentioned before, it's really important that we practice the principle of least privilege in our, functions and our serverless applications, because ultimately we want to make sure that if they're compromised, the attacker can't then move to more sensitive data throughout the system.
Makes sense.
I think a common mistake, like not with respect to security, but just a general mistake with serverless, is that people try to maintain state in their serverless applications. And if you ever want state in a serverless application, you need some like third party or not third party, but out of band data store. So you need a database, you need Redis, a memcache, file system, right? Something that persists beyond the lifetime of the serverless machine. I see a lot of developers who are like, oh, like I'll just put it in memory. And they don't realize that like that that is true if it's running on a VM, but in a serverless world, like that could spin up and spin down at any time. It could auto scale, and now you have more than one. And now your in-memory map, half the time you get the right value and half the time you don't, because depending on which instance the load balancer routes the user to, they get a different experience. And I see that as a pretty common pattern, especially people who are used to developing on like a bare metal or VM-based world where they can assure that like there's one instance of the application and it's constantly running. That pattern is just different in the serverless world. We have to assume that things are ephemeral, things are going to spin up and spin down at will.
Yeah, I mean that's a good thing to aim for, regardless of your actual platform, isn't it? So you can get that horizontal scalability even in compute. Speaking of, so along the lines of serverless, then one of the things I keep seeing crop up on places like Twitter and Reddit when I allow myself to look at them are these sort of arguments around serverless versus this, serverless versus that, and there seem to be two camps sometimes of serverless and container-based solutions. I was going to ask you, first of all, do you think that's ever been a valid argument? Because obviously there's different ways to do different things. And do you think that Cloud Run, which I'm a big fan of, has kind of put a stop to that argument because it's kind of the best of both worlds?
So I think with respect to like any versus argument, marketing is going to market. Like it's marketing's job is to convince people and convince an industry that a certain pattern or behavior is better than another so that they can drive sales, right? That is irrespective of the technology itself. So a lot of times when you see that messaging, you have to understand that it's coming from a place of revenue generation and not from a place of technological innovation. That being said, like it depends on what your unit of distribution is. Like that's ultimately what the argument is over, is what is the distribution unit for serverless? I think with Lambda, Amazon would have argued that the distribution unit is code, right? It's your Python code, it's your Ruby code, whatever. And I think with Google Cloud Functions, we would have a similar argument that the distribution unit is your code, right? It's your Go, it's your Python, and you deploy the code. I think when you look at something like App Engine or Cloud Run, the deployable unit is your artifact and all of its dependencies, or your application and all of its dependencies. So, when you look at a Cloud Function, that works great if you have some like serverless JSON HTTP endpoint. But when you look at what if I need to serve something that looks like a website? Well, where do I put my HTML files? Where do I put my CSS? There isn't a place for that in a Cloud Function. So you either have to like shove it into the code as like a giant string, which is really hard to maintain, or you need a different abstraction, right? You need a different packaging format for the application. So a Cloud Function deploys code. Cloud Run deploys an application container or a wrapper around not just the code, but any dependencies that code needs. And those dependencies could be, like I said, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files for running a little website. It also could be system level packages, right? Maybe you need image magic because you're doing some image manipulation and you have a Ruby gem that binds to that, right? Or you need the Postgres bindings because that's how you talk to Postgres or something, right? So with Cloud Functions, you're deploying some code. With Cloud Run, you're deploying code and any of the dependencies that code needs to function. And what this means is that the artifact itself is more portable because I can take that artifact, the container image, and I can run it on Kubernetes, I can run it on my local laptop, I can run it on Cloud Run, and I get the same experience because the application and all of its requirements are bundled in the same place. And that's not necessarily true for like a Lambda function or a Cloud Function, where running the code on my local laptop could produce a different result than running it on Cloud Functions or running it on Lambda. And that's really the key difference there, is what is your deliverable? And the trade-off is, with Cloud Functions and Lambda, I don't have to build a container. I just push my code, right? I say, here's my code, please run it for me. With Cloud Run, there is an intermediate step where you have to build a container, right? And Fargate is very similar, right? You have to build a deployable artifact. And there are things that we're doing to try to make that easier, right? We just introduced build packs, but ultimately like a container is built, whether you build it or it's built on your behalf. And then the container is the deployable artifact. So it does introduce an additional step, which is a build step. but that build step also gives you a lot more control over what your application is packaged with, in what format it's packaged with. And you can also add a lot of CI/CD into that process. So you can add your security scanning into that build step, like I talked about earlier. And now you can make sure that you never build a container that has a known vulnerability, because you do that at build time instead of at runtime.
Excellent.
And we use a lot of Cloud Run in the exposure notifications project as well. And part of the reason that we went with Cloud Run is, we do have some like HTML and CSS attributes that we have to bundle in package. And Cloud Run offers, a really convenient way with the Docker file to just put those in the container. They're now in the container's file system and they're available. And if I run that container on my laptop, I get the exact same thing as if I was running it in Cloud Run.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, Cloud Run's very interesting. We managed to organize a Cloud Run event in Cambridge. I also run GDG Cambridge, and yeah, I think there were a lot of interest, at the time as well from folks from Cambridge. So that's good. Ricardo, do you have other questions?
Yes, and this is more related to a trend that is happening with cloud providers. Recently, it was announced by AWS something that was called AWS Controllers for Kubernetes, which is basically AWS is mapping all their services around Kubernetes controllers and Kubernetes operators, and something similar is happening with Azure and Microsoft. And I want to know your take on this. Is this a trend in the industry? Are all the cloud providers going to go in that direction, in which they are mapping all their services to Kubernetes operators or controllers?
So I think that Kubernetes is becoming, or maybe has become, like an industry standard API for deploying applications and services. And it's helpful for cloud providers to leverage that pre-existing knowledge that developers have with respect to building cloud services. So instead of learning a new tool like Terraform or Deployment Manager or CloudFormation, right, being able to leverage the same tool, Kubernetes, and the same configuration syntax, YAML, for provisioning those cloud resources reduces the barrier to entry for developers to learn the ins and outs of cloud. Right? Because a lot of people working with Kubernetes may not be familiar with cloud. Like they know Kubernetes, they know the Kubernetes object model, but you start talking about, IAM and cloud resources and databases, and like that's an area where they may not have expertise. And being able to lower the barrier to entry by making this a single configuration language makes it easier for developers and people who have to interact with those cloud resources to do so. I think where the tension comes is that people think that cloud providers are going to force people to move to the Kubernetes model to consume their APIs. And I don't think that that's true. So I think this is another option for developers to interact with the cloud provider APIs. But I don't think that we're moving towards a world where everyone has to learn the Kubernetes API in order to create a database on a cloud provider, or spin up a Cloud Run instance, for example. I think it's just another choice. It's giving people choice and flexibility in how they interact with cloud providers. And we're seeing a lot of uptick, not just in the Kubernetes space, but a lot of uptick in the kind of infrastructure as code community around this idea of giving people freedom and flexibility to interact with cloud providers, right? This is, Terraform has their new CDK. Pulumi has multiple languages, right? Amazon has a CDK now where people don't want to be restricted in the languages and the formats and the ways in which they interact with these cloud provided APIs. Some people want to use Python, some people want to use Node, some people want to use Ruby, some people want to use one more declarative syntax like JSON or YAML or HCL. And providing that freedom and flexibility is ultimately beneficial to the cloud provider because it means they're lowering the barrier to entry for people to consume the services, given that they have some pre-existing knowledge. And I think that's really what we're seeing as well with centralization around some of the Kubernetes specific APIs is there are people who have Kubernetes knowledge who may not have cloud provider specific knowledge, and doing so gives them the ability to use the cloud provider without learning a whole new language and a whole new framework.
Okay. there are a few questions from the audience, but let's finish up with questions from Tim and Ricardo first. So, Tim, have you got another question for Seth?
Yeah, I just did one more quick question, which was, what are you working on right now that you're excited about that you're allowed to tell us about?
What am I working on right now? I mean, like exposure notifications is largely my full-time job right now. Prior to that, we launched Secret Manager at Google. I played a really large role in doing that. But really, like the vast majority of my day is spent on exposure notifications. We have some fun things coming down the pipe there, particularly around what we call EN Express, which isn't super useful for this conversation because it only affects the United States. But it's the current challenge with exposure notifications is that individual countries and states and health authorities have to make their own app. They have to make an app and they have to implement some API calls and they have to ship it. With EN Express, we're expediting that process by basically creating apps for you. So you click a button, you get an app, and it's kind of like insert your logo here. And there's a lot of work to be done on that, both on the app minting side, but also on the server side. So we've been kind of full steam ahead supporting that and some of the logistics around it, with the hope that, we can start in the US and then eventually help other public health authorities move on.
Fantastic.
Sounds good. Ricardo, do you have another question before we take questions from the audience?
Yes, and I'm wrapping around the working from home topic. Do you feel that everybody working from home is making working from home better once everybody's and once what will happen after some people will be returning to the office, how that will kind of change the dynamics at the working from home?
Yeah, so I think there's a difference between a company being remote first and being remote friendly. And I think this has given people a lot of empathy for the challenges and benefits of working from home. So whereas previously, if someone worked from home and none of their coworkers had ever worked from home, they may not have understood the value of having all of their conversations in chat or making sure that there's a video call attached to every calendar invite. Now people have empathy, right? People realize that by having a conversation in the kitchen or, standing in line for lunch versus having a conversation in a shared chat room where everyone can participate excludes people. And that cultural shift and that empathy is important, and it's important that we've now built that. And I think people have an understanding that we need to make sure that everyone can participate in these conversations, even people who aren't physically there at the time. I think the pandemic also in general has forced people to reevaluate some of their priorities, both at the company level and at the personal level. And I think some companies are now realizing that the artificial deadlines that they've imposed are bullshit, and they're happy to let them slip. And I think employees are starting to realize that the free food and the ping pong tables were what they came to the office for. And when those are gone, they don't really want to go into the office anymore. And they really enjoy not having a 6-hour commute every day, more so than they enjoyed the ping pong tables and the free snacks. And I think people are just constantly being forced to reevaluate what matters to them in this pandemic, whether it's at the corporate level or at the family level. And I think as the pandemic dies down, people are going to really voice their new preferences, their newfound preferences. And I think it's going to force companies to adapt and accommodate, or potentially lose, top talent to other organizations. I think you're muted.
Yep.
So yeah, we have some questions from the audience, so I'm gonna pull them in, and then we can come back to some more questions from Ricardo and Tim, and if they have got any. So let's start with the first question here, and it's about Cloud Run, I believe. Yeah. So you're seeing the question, right?
Yeah, I can just kind of paraphrase it if that helps for folks. So Matthias asks, would you say it's better to embed things like CSS into the container image, or would you coordinate with an object store like Google Cloud Storage to store and host them there? Honestly, either. It depends on what you're optimizing for. So in our particular case, we are optimizing for moving very, very quickly and having everything in this deployable artifact so that we could give it to someone else and they could run it. And we are iterating on the CSS and the JavaScript very rapidly. So we wouldn't want to get into a situation where we've given someone the HTML files or something and the code bundled in the container, and then they run it for a while and we update the CSS on the object storage or the CDN, for example, and something breaks because they're not running the latest container image. So the advantage of having all of the CSS and JavaScript and assets bundled in the container is that you're tightly coupling those assets to the code, in this example, the Go code, but whatever language code that serves those assets. So you're basically guaranteeing that like 100 years from now, if someone runs that container, it'll still run. The disadvantage is that you're not getting like the global geographic distribution. You're not getting the benefits of like a CDN. You're not getting the benefits of browser level caching and distribution. And that's just a trade-off that we chose to make in this particular example. And we have some plans to innovate there a little bit, but we only serve like 2 kilobytes total. So the benefits of having something like a CDN or globally available object storage isn't super beneficial for this particular use case. But if it were different, if we were serving lots and lots of images, we would probably reevaluate to using something like an object store like GCS.
Great. Okay, next question from the audience. Has the cost of using cloud services come down the last few months? I guess this is coming from, because more companies are probably going to be taking up and signing up for these services. Is there any sort of help for companies who are getting on the cloud train?
I think many providers have graciously extended free tiers for various services, right? Like we did this with G Suite. We extended larger groups and some of the enterprise features to all accounts for a few months. I think more companies are moving to the cloud. I don't necessarily think that the pandemic has forced organizations to move to the cloud any faster than they already were. If anything, it might have slowed things down a little bit as companies reevaluate kind of their spend rate and their run rate. I don't think, like most cloud pricing is purely a race to the bottom, right? It's how, the major public cloud providers are always undercutting one another on prices, and it's largely a race to like the commoditization of infrastructure and various services. So they're always going down. I don't think it's necessarily related to the pandemic. I would actually argue that while the monetary costs may be going down, there's more to cost than just monetization, right? There's the human intellectual cost. And I think the cost of using cloud services for humans is always going up, right? We're never seeing a decrease in the complexity of the cloud, right? There's always more services. There's always more features. There's always some new thing. And the complexity that a human has to take on when just deciding between two cloud providers or deciding between two services of the same provider, for example, that cost is constantly increasing at a very steady rate. A good example is, do you use Amazon SNS or do you use Pinpoint to send some text messages, right? How do you decide between those two, right? Do you decide between Cloud Run and Fargate, or do you get all your information? How do you decide whether this is like marketing information that's designed to push you to make a decision or some technical information where you can go and make your own decision? That cost is constantly going up. And it's a cost that platform engineers and infrastructure engineers continue to burden and continue to, obviously gain a lot of knowledge. But every time we introduce a new product or service across any cloud provider, we're increasing that cost.
Okay, I'm not seeing. Oh no, actually, there is maybe in a little while. Maybe we can take a question from Ricardo or Tim first before we move on to the next audience question.
Yes, following that question, Do you think that there is such thing like a cloud-agnostic architecture, or you rather to refer to that as a multi-cloud architecture?
I believe that when people say multi-cloud and cloud agnostic, everyone has their own definition. I think it's possible to abstract the core functionality of a cloud provider, like compute, networking, and storage, into a minimum abstraction. So you can take EC2 and compute engine, and you can create a bare bones minimum compute layer that doesn't care whether it's running on Google or Amazon, for example. You can do the same for storage, right? And I would argue that like S3 and S3 compliant APIs have already done that to a certain extent. Like even Google Cloud Storage has an S3 compliant API. So you can point to it and talk to it just like you would S3, but it's actually DCS, right? That is already kind of the minimum commoditization there. And there's tools like Minio and whatnot that do it on other services like Azure. And then at the network layer, right, it's all just IPs and VPCs, right? So when you take those three primitive properties, compute, networking, and storage, I think you can get to a world where you never think about a particular cloud provider and you don't care. The moment you, but I would also argue that those are the most expensive resources in terms of the cost to the organization, because the amount of effort that you need to put in to make them work for you is very high, right? You just have compute, networking, and storage. So if you want to run a database, you're running your own database. You're building your own SLA for that database, right? You're building your own access model. If you want identity, right, because you've only chosen to leverage compute, networking, and storage, now you need your own identity provider. So instead of using IAM from a cloud provider, now you have to use something like HashiCorp Vault, or you have to use Okta, or you have to use some OIDC provider, right? So you're bringing in your own complexity on top of that compute, networking, and storage. So is it possible? Yes, but in general, organizations that have success with cloud providers tend to be using the higher level functionality, not the lower level functionality. So like compute, networking, and storage is great, but what it powers is things like Cloud Run, which is just like, here's a container, go run it for me and scale it infinitely. That's where, as a developer, I can move very, very quickly. As an operator, I don't have to care. It's managed and it has a great SLA. As a security engineer, I can add all of these controls with org policies to make sure that my developers don't do stupid things that are going to get me in trouble, and I can enable security scanning. That's still powered by that same lower layer, but that technology and that intellectual property that makes Cloud Run great isn't really multi-cloud, right? That the differentiating functionality can't be multi-cloud. Like that's why it's differentiating, is because it doesn't run the same everywhere. And I think you have to find a middle ground. And I think Cloud Run's a really good example where Cloud Run is proprietary technology based off of an open source specification called Knative. Containers are also an open specification. So if you choose containerization as your packaging format, you can use Cloud Run on GCP. You can use Fargate on AWS. You can use Azure container instances, or you can use Kubernetes with Knative on Azure or any of the other cloud providers, right? You get a multi-cloud experience, but that's different than multi-cloud where like everything looks the same and you use like one config and you never care whether it's on Azure, GCP, AWS, Alibaba, whatever. So it's, when people talk about multi-cloud, I always ask, like, what do you actually care about? Do you care about disaster recovery? Like, are you worried that some cloud provider is just going to shut down and you need to move to another one? Because that's a different conversation than, I'm worried that, I want to be able to balance price and this is cheaper than that, right? And that's different than, I just never want to think about cloud providers. And if you never want to think about a specific cloud provider, you have to drop to the lowest common denominator, which is compute, networking, and storage. But if you're really just looking for, hey, I want to make sure that my applications can run in any cloud provider in case there's any type of natural disaster or price arbitraging so that I can quickly move between one and the other, that's a different way of thinking about multi-cloud. And usually when organizations say multi-cloud or hybrid cloud, it takes a little bit of digging to get them to truly understand what they want. And sometimes they don't know, right? So do I believe that multi-cloud is a thing? Like, absolutely. We have many organizations that are successfully using multiple cloud providers. I also believe that hybrid cloud is a thing, right? We have a technology called Anthos that lets you run basically a subset of Google Cloud on infrastructure that you control. That infrastructure could be another cloud provider, or it could be on-premise. And we have customers that are successfully doing that. We also know that in countries like Australia, regulated industries like fintech are required to be on multiple clouds. Like the government forces banks to be on multiple clouds in some jurisdictions. And this is why like multi-cloud is a reality. It's not going anywhere. But the way that organizations choose to implement multi-cloud is ultimately that. It's a choice. And for some people, multi-cloud is like, yeah, I use storage from Amazon and compute from network. That's technically multi-cloud, right? But that's different than my application can run on any cloud and it doesn't care, right? So there's a sliding scale, and I actually think we need to do a lot more research and market research and surveying and potentially invent new words here that describe subsets of what people mean when they say multi-cloud.
Okay, thanks for that, Seth. So we have a question from one. There are two questions from one person, so we probably pull both up one after the other. So this is the first one from Robin. So he's interested in developing mobile to cloud apps that handle context, as in I'm here. So what information do you have that is relevant for me? And his follow-up question to that, I'll bring it up now as well, is aligned to that. What Seth said about global security context. Are you seeing GCP components being modeled in that way?
A little bit, right? So we have on Google Cloud, we have a thing called IAM conditions. Those IAM conditions can tie into like context-aware access. So just like I was saying earlier, like there are certain things internally at Google that I can't access from my phone, even though I'm authenticated. The same is true for IAM. So I'll talk about Secret Manager for a second because I'm super familiar with it. With Secret Manager, we integrate with VPC service controls and context-aware access. So what that means is that you can enable VPC-SC and context-aware access on Secret Manager, and you can give someone IAM permissions to access a secret or create a secret. But then you can add a condition, and that condition can say that they must be making this request from a mobile device that has a 6-digit or greater password, right? That's the context-aware access piece, right? Is the device that's making this request, even though Seth is authenticated, the device from which he's coming from must have certain requirements for password complexity. And I can create that IAM permission, and I can have all the permissions in the world. I'm totally logged into my phone. But if I remove my passcode, I no longer satisfy that context-aware part, so I'm not authenticated. Right, so it adds additional context to who I am and what I'm doing, but where I'm accessing it from is part of that context. I think that's a little bit different than. It sounds like a little bit, Robin, like you're asking like location-aware context for a mobile app, which is similar to like Google Maps. You open up Google Maps and you say like food near me, and it finds you restaurants and things that used to be open before a pandemic that are near you. And that's like a slightly different model because that's not really a security context. That is a location-based context, and it typically uses like location on your phone or GPS triangulation, and then it's just a simple radius search around you. That's different than the context that I'm describing in a security context, which is more of like the device or the machine or the situation in which a resource is being accessed. And that's what we mean by context. It's like the device, the situation, the time of day. Right? IAM conditions has an amazing feature where you can say this resource, like Seth has access to this resource 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. So that means if I try to access it outside of normal working hours, I get access denied. And no one needs to go in and create and deprovision these accounts constantly. It's just automatically handled by IAM conditions.
Okay, I think we're kind of running out of time. It's been an hour, so I'm just gonna ask Ricardo and Tim if you've got any like last questions for Seth before we wrap up, or are we good?
No more questions from me. Just wanted to say I really enjoyed the chat, and thanks very much for offering to do this.
Ricardo?
Seth.
Thank you very much, Seth, for your time and insight.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for having me. Sorry I can't be there in person, using air quotes, for DevFest on the 17th, but I hope all of you can be there in person on the 17th.
Yeah, it's gonna be, as I said, an exciting day because we've got 6 tracks with 60 plus speakers, on cloud, mobile, and hot tech, and so many other things. So make sure you don't miss that. So hopefully you can join us on the 17th. As I said, just check out the website as well, which is devfestuki.com. You'll find a list of speakers there, as well as a list of the schedule. So the full schedule is there. And when you actually look at the schedule, it will be displayed in your local time. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Qatar or Manila or Paris or whatever. It will adjust to your time, not just the time. It will not just show the time for UK and Ireland, but for where you are as well. So it's location aware, as we were chatting about earlier. So hope to see you there, and thank you again, Seth, for joining us. And any last few messages from you, Tim, or Ricardo regarding the event?
Looking forward to it.
Looking
Perfect.
forward.
Thanks again, Seth.
I'll leave you all with one bit of trivia, which I like to end most things with some random fact. Since you just mentioned time zones, make sure, hey, all you developers out there, make sure that you're always storing your time zones as minutes, not hours, since UTC offset, because there are multiple time zones in the world that are 30 minutes or 15 minutes. India has a few 30-minute time zones, so don't make that assumption that a time zone is exactly plus or minus 1 hour, because you're wrong.
Definitely. And time zones are always confusing. Whenever I'm organizing something that spans one time zone, it's a nightmare. Right. So thanks again, Seth, for that, and enjoy your vacation. I know you're going on vacation. That's why you cannot make it to the event on the 17th. And yeah, enjoy that with your family.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.